Hello everyone, and welcome to the 191st episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring our patron pick for August 2024, Gollum from the Gollum game. Only kidding, of course. In fact, in this video, we are going to be talking about Gollum, but we're not going to be using anything but The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to do so, as though there is some Lord of the Rings content out there that provides some supplementary information for Tolkien's characters. I'm more so fond of sticking to canon when it comes to Middle-earth. There's a bit of news I'd like to announce before we get going though, and that's that I've recently decided to open up the channel memberships feature on this channel. For those of you who don't know, a channel membership is essentially a subscription to my channel, which you can sign up for using 4 different tiers I've created, each of which will offer you a different set of perks, with the most exciting one that each tier has access to being your participation in polls I'll be holding each month that will decide one of the characters I'll be covering in a video the following month. And I plan on adding a whole bunch of other perks to these tiers in the near future, which I'll be sure to announce to anyone who signs up, and in any future videos when those perks launch. Obviously, this is far from being a requirement to watch my videos or to support me, as each and every one of your views, comments, and likes helps me out immensely. But if you're a big fan of what I do, and you'd like to support me even further, be sure to check out everything a membership to this channel has to offer by clicking the join button on my channel's homepage. So now that we have that out of the way, we can start talking about our subject of this episode, Gollum, the most pitiable and wretched creature in all the Tolkien Legendarium that was brought to life in a spectacular way by the legendary Andy Serkis, a tragic character that has become nothing less than one of the most iconic characters of not just his archetype, but of all time. As many of you will know, I am a gigantic fan of Tolkien, and I'm glad everyone who chose this character to be featured this month have given me yet another opportunity to talk about his works. And since I've taken up enough of your time with this intro already, without further ado, let's begin. Ages of history often begin and end with monumental events that change the world for better or for worse. And in the world of Middle-earth, the Second Age ended with the death and destruction wrought by Sauron and his forces during his first attempt to conquer the world. But the Third Age, which could have belonged to Sauron had he succeeded, began with a solemn happiness in the wake of his defeat, ushering in a long, yet tenuous peace that endured for many centuries afterward. Such a peace was not meant to last though, as Isildur's foolish decision to keep the dreaded ring he had cut from Sauron's hand rather than destroy it, doomed all of Middle-earth to one day suffer again the dark power of Sauron. For so long as the ring endures, so too does the spirit of Sauron. But as I'm sure you'll know full well, Sauron without his ring is only a shadow of what he would be with it, for he put much of himself within his greatest creation, and he can never truly be whole without it. Because this is the case though, the ring is a sentient object with a mind of its own, and as a part of Sauron, whenever it is away from him, it is always searching for ways to return to him, and it's this search that leads the ring to encounter perhaps the 2 unluckiest hobbits who ever lived, Smeagol and Deagol. When Isildur kept the ring for himself, he enjoyed its power for a time, but upon journeying to Rivendell just 2 years after Sauron's defeat, Isildur and his party were happened upon by a band of orcs, and after fleeing from this battle with the ring in tow, the ring slipped from his finger while he was swimming across the Anduin, and was lost for approximately 2,461 years. In the time period between its loss and its founding, many important events occurred in Middle-earth. One of those events being the settlement of the Shire around the year 1630 by the 3 scattered subspecies of hobbits, the Harfoots, the Fallowhides, and the Stoors. Not all hobbits chose to head to the Shire though, and one such group was a population of Stoors who had settled in the Gladden Fields by the Anduin after fleeing Eriador in the wake of the wars with the Witch King of Angmar between the years 1356 to 1409. Unfortunately, the Gladden Fields was the location of Isildur's fall 14 centuries prior, and thus it was the resting place of the ring. Even so, this pocket of hobbit civilization managed to grow and endure for over 1,000 years, and it would not be until the year 2463 that the ring would be given its chance to be rediscovered. In this hobbitish settlement, there lived a prominent and wealthy family that was headed by an elderly matriarch, and from this family is where the hobbit once known as Smeagol originated. Smeagol was described as being the most inquisitive and curious-minded of that family. He was interested in roots and beginnings. He dived into deep pools. He burrowed under trees and growing plants. He tunneled into green mounds, and he ceased to look up at the hilltops, or the leaves on trees, or the flowers opening in the air. His head and eyes were downward. Wherever he went, Smeagol was oft accompanied by his friend Deagol, a friend who was of a like mind, but one who was described as being sharp-eyed, but not so quick or strong as Smeagol. On Smeagol's birthday, he and Deagol were down by the river fishing when Deagol caught a rather large fish that drug him under the water, and it was at this moment that the ring took its chance and revealed itself to Deagol, who promptly scooped it up and brought it back with him to the surface. Who knows what the ring would have done to Deagol's mind, as the only reaction we're given from him regarding the ring is a quiet admiration, but its corrupting influence on Smeagol was instantaneous. Overcome with a sense of wonder as Smeagol's eyes found their way to the most captivating thing they'd ever laid themselves on, Smeagol was seduced by the ring's power and strangled his dearest friend after he refused to give it to him as a birthday present. From this moment on, a slow, yet altogether quick transformation began in Smeagol. No one had ever found out what had become of Deagle. He was murdered far from home, and his body was cunningly hidden. But Smeagol returned alone, and he found that none of his family could see him when he was wearing the ring. He was very pleased with his discovery, and he concealed it, and he used it to find out secrets, and he put his knowledge to crooked and malicious uses. He became sharp-eyed and keen-eared for all that was hurtful. The ring had given him power, according to his stature. It is not to be wondered at that he became very unpopular and was shunned, when visible, by all his relations. They kicked him, and he bit their feet. He took to thieving, and going about muttering to himself, and gurgling in his throat. So they called him Gollum, and cursed him, and told him to go far away. And his grandmother, desiring peace, expelled him from the family, and turned him out of her hole. He wandered in loneliness, weeping a little for the hardness of the world. And he journeyed up the river, till he came to a stream that flowed down from the mountains, and he went that way. He caught fish in deep pools with invisible fingers, and ate them raw. One day it was very hot, and as he was bending over a pool, he felt a burning on the back of his head, and a dazzling light from the water pained his wet eyes. He wondered at it, for he had almost forgotten about the sun. Then for the last time, he looked up and shook his fist at her, but as he lowered his eyes, he saw far ahead the tops of the misty mountains, out of which the stream came. And he thought suddenly, it would be cool and shady under those mountains. The sun could not watch me there. The roots of those mountains must be roots indeed. There must be great secrets buried there, which have not been discovered since the beginning. So he journeyed by night up into the highlands, and he found a little cave out of which the dark stream ran, and he wormed his way like a maggot into the heart of the hills, and vanished out of all knowledge. The ring went into the shadows with him, and even the Maker, when his power had begun to grow again, could learn nothing of it. Now the line about the ring affording Smeagol power according to his stature is quite interesting. Smeagol, a furtive thing who was fond of rooting around in the muck and the dark for secrets, was transformed into an imp who did much the same thing, only now with the secrets of his fellow hobbits, rather than the secrets lying in the earth. If we look to another ring-bearer to see what changes were made to their persons, like Bilbo, we find that comparing the two tell us something interesting about Smeagol's character, and this comparison further expands upon the notion of the ring giving power to an individual, according to their stature. Bilbo Baggins was a kind soul who had not a hint of malice in his heart, and so when he obtained the ring, he saw its beauty, yes, but it did not have the overwhelming hold over him that it had over Smeagol. Bilbo endeavored to keep the ring from Gollum once he encountered him, but his hesitance to reveal the ring to him was more so born out of his inclination not to reveal anything to a monster he had just encountered, rather than a greedy desire to keep for himself what he'd taken from another. In the subsequent years that he possessed the ring, the only real effect that it had on Bilbo was the prolongment of his life, as Bilbo only ever used the ring to play tricks on others, or to escape some of his more annoying relatives. The only malice that manifested in Bilbo as a result of the ring's influence came when Gandalf or Frodo tried to take the ring or keep it from him respectively. But that seems to be a universal effect of the ring that no one is safe from, no matter who they are. Therefore, because Bilbo was a kind soul through and through, the ring could not grant him any sort of power beyond its natural effect of prolonging mortal lives, as the ring seems to feed off the negative inclinations of its target, and then amplifies them greatly. And if there's nothing to amplify, then the corruption is minimal. I believe this contrast between Bilbo and Smeagol's reaction to the ring proves this notion, as if Smeagol had a similar disposition to Bilbo, I don't think he would have been affected by the ring in the way that he was. The ring had given him power according to his stature. What stature this line is referring to must be the fact that in his heart, Smeagol was in some small or great ways malicious, covetous, and greedy. And because he was, the ring was immediately able to latch onto these traits and began to transform him into a hideous creature. Now that isn't to say that Smeagol was necessarily a bad person though, and that's shown to us in the way that he becomes a creature torn between two personas, Smeagol and Gollum. While Smeagol may have held some negative traits in his heart, there are plenty of people the world over who do. In fact, I'd go as far as to state that each and every one of us holds within ourselves some less than desirable traits. Though that's true, most of us are able to stifle those parts as we gain a greater understanding of empathy, and only in certain situations that are few and far between will those traits rear their ugly heads. This would have undoubtedly been the case with Smeagol. I'm sure that Smeagol would have committed some small injustices against his fellow hobbits over the course of his life, but never in his wildest dreams would he have even thought of murdering his dearest friend, as that is simply not a line that a mostly gentle creature like Smeagol would have been willing to cross. In other words, Smeagol was not an evil creature before he encountered the ring. He was just a person like any other who had a couple of negative traits. But once the devil metaphorically draped his claws over his shoulders, what little negativity there was in Smeagol the Stoor was crafted into an ever-present revenant that now shared his body and would do battle with Smeagol's better nature for the rest of his unnatural life. Here's what Gandalf had to say to Frodo regarding this aspect of Smeagol and the ring's influence over him. Even Gollum was not wholly ruined. He had proved tougher than even one of the wise would have guessed, as a hobbit might. There was a little corner of his mind that was still his own, and light came through it as through a chink in the dark, light out of the past. It was actually pleasant, I think, to hear a kindly voice again, bringing up memories of wind and trees and sun on the grass and such forgotten things. But that, of course, would only make the evil part of him angrier in the end, unless it could be conquered, unless it could be cured. Gandalf sighed. Alas, there is little hope of that for him. Yet not no hope, not though he possessed the ring so long, almost as far back as he can remember. For it was long since he had worn it much. In the black darkness, it was seldom needed. Certainly he had never faded. He is thin and tough still, but the thing was eating up his mind, of course, and the torment had become almost unbearable. All the great secrets under the mountains had turned out to be just empty night. There was nothing more to find out, nothing worth doing, only nasty furtive eating and resentful remembering. He was altogether wretched. He hated the dark, and he hated light more. He hated everything, and the ring most of all. "What do you mean?" said Frodo. "Surely the ring was his precious, and the only thing he cared for. But if he hated it, why didn't he get rid of it, or go away and leave it?" "You ought to begin to understand, Frodo, after all you have heard," said Gandalf. "He hated it, and loved it, as he hated and loved himself. He could not get rid of it. He had no will left in the matter. A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. At most, he plays with the idea of handing it on to someone else's care, and that only at an early stage, when it first begins to grip. But as far as I know, Bilbo alone in history has ever gone beyond playing, and really done it. He needed all my help too, and even so, he would never have just forsaken it, or cast it aside. It was not Gollum, Frodo, but the ring itself that decided things. The murder of Deagol haunted Gollum, and he had made up a defense, repeating it to his precious over and over again, as he gnawed bones in the dark until he almost believed it. It was his birthday. Deagol ought to have given the ring to him. It had obviously turned up just so as to be a present. It was his birthday present, and so on, and on. Torment. Hideous, horrible torment that was imposed upon this poor creature by a power far beyond his imagining. And for 478 long years, Smeagol crawled in the dark underbelly of the Misty Mountains in a state of constant but slow decay and ever-present mental and physical anguish, as he was frequently haunted by his past and the murder of his dearest friend. As most of you will know though, Bilbo's arrival in Smeagol's home in that 478th year changed everything for Smeagol, but at the same time only exacerbated the ever-present war that waged in his mind. In our first encounter with Smeagol, we're shown an aspect of his personality that serves as the primary trait of his Gollum persona, a devious cunning that would be present in nearly every action he takes from this moment on. While Smeagol wallows in torment, Gollum will do anything he can to survive. And when Bilbo bested him in a game of riddles, instead of showing him the way out as he had promised, he conspired to use the ring to murder Bilbo so he could eat him. Once Bilbo had escaped, and Gollum was bereft of his precious ring that he had held for close to 5 centuries, he had no choice but to leave his dark home and wander in search of the ring. Perhaps in time, Gollum may have been cured of the ring's influence, or at the very least, been allowed to perish as its life-giving properties slowly evaporated from his person. But unlike Bilbo, who had held the ring for only 78 years, and had not been so thoroughly corrupted by it, even a 78-year absence from the ring wasn't enough to reverse 478 years of corruption. And with Sauron's growing power in the east, and Gollum's attachment to that power, he was eventually drawn to the Black Land, where he endured tortures unimaginable, and revealed to Sauron who currently held the ring, a Baggins of the Shire, which would end up setting Gollum on his course to reuniting with his precious, and finding for himself a new master. The tale of Gollum's search for Frodo is rife with conspiratorial collusion with orcs and other fell creatures on Gollum's part. And indeed, for quite some time, Gollum served as a scout for the hordes of evil that were searching for the Fellowship and the ring they carried. And for his part in guiding the orcs, much misery can partly be attributed to his actions. Once he found Frodo, though, an interesting dance occurs that shows us further how horrendously sad Smeagol's lot in life is. As Gandalf had said to Frodo when he was speaking to him about Bilbo's encounter with Gollum, it was actually pleasant to hear a kindly voice again, bringing up memories of wind and trees and sun on the grass and such forgotten things. And as this was the case with Bilbo, so too was it with Frodo. When Gollum was taken on by Frodo as his guide to Mordor, Gollum swore an oath on the ring to aid the Master of his precious and bring him no harm. But behind that promise, a plan was made, one fit for the devious creature that Gollum became. For he endeavored to lead Frodo and Sam to the pass of Cirith Ungol, where Shelob, the last surviving child of the great darkness that was Ungoliant, lay in wait. But as Gollum traveled with Frodo and Sam, Smeagol slowly began to take precedence over Gollum, as not only did Gollum find kinship with these two fellows who he was much alike with far in the past, but in Frodo, he found a master who did not treat him with contempt and disgust, but with pity and understanding. For Frodo knew better than anyone how heavy the ring weighs on a person's mind, and what it can do to them. The war in Smeagol's mind would continue, but now it was more so a battle that was waged on equal footing than it was one-sided in favor of Gollum. And there are many moments where Smeagol, despite the disgusting eating habits he developed over the years, was a pleasant and amiable companion. And if it weren't for two things in particular, it's possible that Smeagol would have become a willing participant in the destruction of the ring, as small as the possibility might have been. One is Sam's consistent negative treatment of him. To be fair, Sam had plenty of reasons to distrust Gollum, as it is true that he had been conspiring to betray them the entire time he was with them. But what little progress Gollum made during his time with the pair was often deadened by Sam's treatment of him. And if Sam could have found a way to treat him in much the same way that Frodo had, rather than his animosity continuing to build, the renewed positive traits that Smeagol began to show may have become more prominent. The second event that caused Smeagol to regress further into his Gollum persona was his capture by Faramir. Though he actually wasn't, Gollum believed in this moment that Frodo was trying to betray him, and he could not let that notion go no matter how false it was. And if there was a chance before this moment of Smeagol abandoning his plan of feeding the two to Shelob, that chance was all but eliminated after this event. There was a sliver of hope, however, before they arrived at Shelob's lair. While Frodo and Sam were sleeping on the stairs up to Cirith Ungol, Gollum experienced the following. And so Gollum found them hours later when he returned, crawling and creeping down the path out of the gloom ahead. Sam sat propped against the stone, his head dropping sideways, and his breathing heavy. In his lap lay Frodo's head, drowned deep in sleep. Upon his white forehead lay one of Sam's brown hands, and the other lay softly upon his master's breast. Peace was in both their faces. Gollum looked at them. A strange expression passed over his lean, hungry face. The gleam faded from his eyes, and they went dim and gray, old and tired. A spasm of pain seemed to twist him, and he turned away, peering back up towards the pass, shaking his head as if engaged in some interior debate. Then he came back, and slowly putting out a trembling hand, very cautiously, he touched Frodo's knee, but almost the touch was a caress. For a fleeting moment, could one of the sleepers have seen him, they would have thought that they beheld an old weary hobbit, shrunken by the years that had carried him far beyond his time, beyond friends and kin, and the fields and streams of youth, an old, starved, pitiable thing. But at that touch, Frodo stirred and cried out softly in his sleep, and immediately, Sam was wide awake. The first thing he saw was Gollum, pawing at Master, as he thought. "Hey you," he said roughly. "What are you up to?" "Nothing, nothing," said Gollum softly. "Nice, Master, I dare say," said Sam. "But where have you been to? Sneaking off and sneaking back, you old villain." Gollum withdrew himself, and a green glint flickered under his heavy lids. Almost spider-like he looked now, crouched back on his bent limbs, with his protruding eyes. The fleeting moment had passed, beyond recall. "Sneaking, sneaking," he hissed. "Hobbits always so polite." "Yes. Oh, nice hobbits. Smeagol brings them up secret ways that nobody else could find. Tired he is, thirsty he is. Yes, thirsty. And he guides them and he searches for paths. And they say sneak, sneak. Very nice friends. Oh yes, my precious. Very nice." Smeagol was always there, and he was yearning to come back to the light, to shun the darkness that had been imposed on him by a great and insidious power. But in the end, what he had become had birthed so much animosity in those that he encountered, that any strides he may have made towards becoming his old self were continuously dashed by others' inabilities to see past the monster, so they might glimpse the man beneath. As Gandalf had claimed early on in the story, Smeagol was ultimately a pitiable being, and though he had become so lost in the depths of the ring's corruption, there was a chance he still had a part to play in ending Sauron once and for all. And indeed he did, for if it were not for Smeagol, Frodo and Sam may not have reached Mount Doom, but the part he played was never guaranteed to end the way it did. Smeagol acknowledged that if the ring were to be destroyed, that he would fade into dust, for his long attachment to the power of the ring was too great, and thus its death would be his own. But if Smeagol had been treated as well as he had been by Frodo, by others, as I said a moment ago, it's entirely possible that he would have become a willing participant in the destruction of the ring. As if Frodo hadn't suffered so dearly at the limbs of Shelob, it's also possible that he wouldn't have wavered at the end. But alas, this story's end was made inevitable by all the events that had occurred leading up to it, and Gollum had perhaps the most crucial part to play in the destruction of the ring, for if he had not wrenched his precious from Frodo's hand with those gnashing teeth of his, perhaps the Nazgul's flight to Mount Doom would have ended in their obtainment of the ring and the return of Sauron's power. In the end, Smeagol's story is ultimately a lesson in two things: the corrupting power of evil, and the idea that no matter how far gone a person is, no matter how hideous of a creature they become, that they are still a person, one who we can sympathize with as a fellow sentient being whose misfortunes in life had led them down a dark path. And as they are still, and always will be a person despite their corruption, there is always a chance that they can be redeemed. It's true, there are some who don't deserve redemption, for their crimes are too great. But for people like Smeagol, a young hobbit who by all accounts would have never strayed into the dark pit of evil he found, there is much to pity, for it is the ring that is to blame for all that Gollum wrought, and all that he became. And to recognize this is to understand that who he was, and what he did, was not at all his fault, something that Gandalf recognized, and Frodo would later come to understand as well. However, as we discussed, no matter how piteous the individual, there are many who can never see past their faults and what they've become to find pity for them. And such was the case with Frodo before he had met Smeagol, whom he had lamented to Gandalf about concerning the fact that Bilbo hadn't killed him when he had the chance to. But to pity another is to put oneself in their shoes and understand the great tragedies that have led to their defilement, to feel their pain and recognize that just as they have fallen, so too can you fall. And if it were you staring back at horrified onlookers through eyes clouded by darkness, you too might desire to be seen and heard for more than the tragic being you have become as a result of the trauma you have suffered. But that is a difficult realization to make, and while the world would be a much better place if more people were capable of discerning when pity and sympathy take precedence over hatred and revulsion, I don't blame the people in this story who reacted to Gollum negatively, for that is only natural considering who they were dealing with. Gollum was a wretched creature, one that murdered his best friend, and if you have any sympathy for them, continued to murder numerous orcs throughout his life as he attempted to survive in any way that he could. And once he re-emerged in the world, he would go on to cause harm directly or indirectly to many individuals. Not to mention that his attempts at getting the ring back from Frodo could have easily led to Sauron's reattainment of it and the advent of a new dark age that would have spelled the deaths or bondage of thousands upon thousands of individuals. But like an addict who never wished to know the drug that destroyed them, Smeagol became a slave to the ring, the vile imp known as Gollum, who served as the greatest example of how horrifying the corruption of Sauron was and what it could do to those it touched. And as wonderful as it would have been had Smeagol had the chance to redeem himself, one little hobbit who, unlike Frodo or Bilbo, had no help in understanding the great and terrible power that had chanced upon him, was consumed by evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Gollum? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my members, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.